right, there's about 14 minutes left until we officially get started. So if you're watching this video, you can probably skip ahead about 12 to 13 minutes. I will give some announcements and reminders before we officially get started today. Otherwise, I would just tell you to skip ahead all the way up until we officially start. But like I said, maybe a little bit before that would be for the best. In the meantime, I'm going to pull up the newest PowerPoint for the chapter we are starting today, and I figured I might as well record that just in case you don't know where to find the PowerPoints on WVSU Online. So let's take a look here. See, I've got to get to the correct course. Of course, announcements. Here we go. Go over here. We are now in module 5, if I remember correctly. Yep. Reproduction at the cellular level. It's the book. We need the PowerPoint right here. If you're looking at it online, you can just scroll through it right here online. Or if for some reason you wanted to download it, you can also do that. And that's what I'm going to be doing, is downloading it. Morning.
I just want to tell you, I know I've been sucking in your class, but I am gonna make some time. I don't know if we have time today. Thank you for letting us in your lab. But I want to learn. I don't know how to do it. What is it?
Hypothesis?
Yeah,
It's just a guess. Like if I ask you, what color do you think is best for photosynthesis? And you say, I think red is. That's a hypothesis.
I just got it.
It's a tentative answer to a question that you can test. That's it. That's all it is. Maybe you're overthinking it.
It's a question that can be tested.
No, I'm asking you the question, or some of that is that it's the answer to the question that you can test.
I need to give the answer to the question given to me.
Yeah, like so in the first lab, is there a correlation between height and finger span? Hypothesis could be yes, there is. No, there is not. It's that simple. And that's if you say yes, there is, we can test that by measuring people's height and their finger span and seeing if there's a correlation.
If I say no, I have to give an example.
No, not unless it asks for one. You just have to just answer the question. That's all hypothesis is answering the question.
Well, I'm gonna go back and when I submit it, I'm gonna submit what lab it is and say late
Okay,
work.
yes.
So that way, I already know. If you get to it, that's fine.
Yeah, and you don't have to say it's late. I already know that. You just submit what you can and let me help you.
But you and my math teacher, you're gonna be like, I think you should have done, you should do it on your own now. No, I still need y'all a couple more days left.
No.
But yeah, I'm not intentionally doing it. I just got a little disfocused because I got purpose.
I understand.
Piece of crap.
Uh,
Yeah, that's come at the worst time. Like I said, that's why I was doing all that extra hard work, because I know, like I have a health history, but this type of breakdown of atoms and stuff like that, we need, I'm not in that type of stuff.
Yeah.
I was a CNA and stuff, so I didn't have to.
Luckily, that's mostly behind us. Alright. Oops.
Is the exam comprehensive?
Only the good question. Only the final exam will be comprehensive. Exam 2 covers everything after exam 1 and up to what we finished on Monday.
Exam 2, or exam 1, the retake done today?
No, not yet. I'll explain that here soon. We've got less than 3 minutes. We are already recording. As usual, I'm going to do old announcements, reminders, not announcements, reminders, stuff that I shouldn't be reminding you, but I'm still having to remind you. So here we go. You guys are in 101-02. So when you guys fill out the forms, when you do videos, you need to put 101-02. Sometimes you'll lose a point if you get it wrong. Sometimes you get a 0 because it might be a little bit hard for me to explain to you. But like when I've got like hundreds of those forms that have been filled out. So when I'm grading them, I go to the sheet where it's filled out, I hit Control F, and I can search for your name or your section number. So if you don't, if you put it in there incorrectly, then I don't have time to go searching for it. So when I search it, if if you haven't put it in there correctly, it won't pop up. Like when I search that term, it'll come up with a 0, like, oh, they didn't do it. So then I'll give you a 0 sometimes. Or sometimes I'll have time and I'll go look it up and sometimes I'll find you. Yes, you are in 101-02. Now, some other reminders that'll help you for lab this week. Some things that I've told you. So you learned that plants are green because they reflect light, right? That's the one color that they don't absorb. You also learned that different types of chlorophyll absorb different colors. So you'll not lose points for this, it's too late anyway, but for your hypothesis, for example, for whether or not different colors of light affect photosynthesis, logically, based on what you've learned in lecture, hopefully you're thinking yes. Because I taught you that some colors are reflected, some colors are absorbed. What are some other things I should tell you? Exam 1, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but again, you can still retake it for now. It's untimed. You can retake it as many times as you want. It's open book. Some other reminders. You have to do the videos. Some of you in here haven't done the video yet for the pre-lab. Some of you haven't done the pre-lab. You can still come to lab, but you can't do any of the experiments, which means you can't get full credit for the lab. What else? Yeah, I guess that's it. Just regular old stuff. Do independent work. Let me help you. It's 8 o'clock, so let's get started. All right, Bangura. Casebolt is here. Tristan, not here. Covington Griggs is here. Devere is not here. Dow, not here. Hughes is here. Lebdy is here. Carla is here. Mankins is not here. Mathis, not here. Rains is here. Reed, not here. Elise, not here. Thompson, here. Dewey is not here. Elkins is not here. Did I miss anybody who's in person? As usual, if you're online, you're just going to need to send the words in. I'm going to do it the same way I've been doing it recently, so I'll ask a question about some information that I just gave you. That will be your attendance word, and at the end of it, I'll be asking you to ask me one question about the material. So even if you say, oh, I understood everything, I don't have a question about the material. From now on, you have to ask a question about the material. Even if you think you know it, that's okay. It's just it's proof that you paid attention. That's all. And that's it. Let's get started. I'm not going to do the announcements yet. I'm going to give it some more time to see if more people show up. But we are about halfway done. Chronologically, we're not halfway done yet because next week is the last week of this first half of the term. But material-wise, we are halfway done. Everything you've learned so far, is either you've already been tested on for exam 1, or you're going to be tested on for chapter 2. So everything you're learning from here on is past the halfway point. Let me back it up here. So, exam 2, the one that's going to talk about here shortly. Exam 2, the one you're about to be tested on, that's basically on energy, right? When it comes to properties of life, it's all about energy. This next exam, for the most part, is going to be about reproduction. So we're going to learn a lot about reproduction and a little bit outside of reproduction, but it's all going to be related to this stuff that you're learning about cellular reproduction. So let's get started. Actually, are there any questions before we get started? All right, so here we go. We are doing chapter 6, which is reproduction at the cellular level. So the first word for attendance is telling me what chapter are we starting? What chapter number are we starting? That's the first word for attendance. So I guess you could say number for attendance. What chapter number are we about to start? And there's a reminder, if you're here in person, you don't have to send those words. But if you do, you'll get extra credit. And if you're online, as usual, you have to send the words before 9 a.m. to be considered present. Before I get started too, I'll also tell you, this is another one of those chapters where I think your old textbook did a better version. So the PowerPoint is based on the old textbook. The information is the same, it's just presented differently. And of course, there's obviously going to be some different examples. So for this, for example, the old textbook always started each chapter with some pictures, and it was kind of like a guessing game, and it gave some pictures, and it's like, all right, what does this have to do with your everyday life? Or why does it matter? So we'll start with this. Can anybody even see? It's kind of blurry, but can anybody tell what this is? Yeah, it's DNA. And it's right next to this woman, and what the old textbook was getting at was that if you were to take one of your strands of DNA and stretch it out, it would be about 6 feet long. So not that that's important, just trivial, slightly interesting information. How about this? Does anybody know what those things are? Bacteria. Good. They do look a lot like bacteria, especially since they color them green for some reason. Yeah, they are chromosomes. They also look like boogers, but they're not boogers. And what the old textbook said for the caption of that picture is keeping track of chromosomes during cell division is vital. Duplicating the wrong number of chromosomes is almost always fatal. So what that really is, whoever said chromosomes was correct, but what else? Another thing it is there's an extra chromosome there. And you're going to learn in this chapter how having extra chromosomes can be bad. How about that picture on the bottom right? I mean, basically, don't even talk about the glowing part yet, but you can see what that's a picture of, right? Yeah, it's like an X-ray of lungs, right? And what that's an actual picture of is a tumor. And the old textbook, the caption for that was, a tumor results from an error in the division of one of the body's own cells. So in this chapter, you're going to learn about cancer and how tumors are formed and things like that. So it's a very relevant chapter. Let me think. So all the stuff we learned previously about photosynthesis and respiration, that's not going to have much to do with what we're learning in this chapter. What we learned about enzymes and energy and all the chemistry stuff and biological molecules, that will be important for this chapter. So, any questions? All right, so this is also from the old textbook. I didn't delete it from the PowerPoint, but I'm not going to talk about it. You can download the PowerPoint and read about it if you want. There's this thing called parthenogenesis. I actually saw about it in the news recently. It happens every few years, or it happens probably more than that, but you see it on the news every few years. Basically, a female will be able to make babies without a male. Sort of like on that Jurassic Park thing. That's a real thing. It does happen. And you can read about it here. You can write about it for independent work if you want. And yeah, again, it's called parthenogenesis. All right. So again, before I jump in, I'm basing this PowerPoint off of the old textbook. So things might be presented in a slightly different order if you're following along in the textbook. The pictures will obviously be different. Some of the examples will be different, but the stuff you need to know for the exam will remain the same. And of course, as always, if there's anything in the PowerPoint that's not in your textbook that you actually need to know, I will point that out and say, hey, this is one of those things where I'm going to test you on it, but it's not in your textbook. I try not to do that, but it might happen. So anyway, the way I'm presenting this chapter, it's broken down into two main parts. The first part is what cell reproduction accomplishes. And then after that, we're going to talk about the cell cycle and mitosis. So here we go. Reproduction. Well, before I go to the next stage or slide, let me ask you this. How many of you have done reproduction? Reproduction. You? Anybody else? Everybody. Yeah, it's kind of a trick question. Most people, when they think of reproduction, when they're not in a biology class, they probably think of like this organism and this organism mated and they had a baby, another organism. And it may result in the birth of new organisms, but it's not always that. You are reproducing right now as you sit here. Cells in your body are going through cellular reproduction. So that's what we're learning about, is cellular reproduction, right? I'm not going to talk about, penises and vaginas and ejaculation and fertilization. Actually, we'll talk about fertilization because we're talking about things from the cellular level. We're not talking about sex or procreation that way, right? This is cellular reproduction. Granted, they are related, and if you want to write anything about sexual reproduction, two organisms getting together, you can write something about that for independent work. Some of it's really interesting. Not to get off topic, but really quickly. Like there's two types of flatworms. I forget what the names are, but they live in the ocean, and they're hermaphroditic. So like if you take one individual flatworm, it's both a male and a female. The way they mate is they try to stab each other with their penises, and whoever stabs who, the stabber is then the male, and the one who got stabbed is the female. So there's some really interesting reproduction that goes on. Anyway, that's off topic. You can look that kind of stuff up for independent work if you want. So anyway, again, we're talking about cellular reproductions. Cells undergo reproduction in something we call cell division. I'm not going to test you on the definition of cellular division or cell division, but this is what we're talking about, right? So cell division, in a sense, is another word for cellular reproduction. When this happens, we have two daughter cells that are produced. If you take notes, I wouldn't even write that down yet because I'm going to get more specific later and tell you exactly how that happens. And there's also two different types of cellular reproduction, and for one of them, this isn't even true. So what I'm giving you now is still just kind of an introduction. Also, in this particular type of cell division, which I haven't named yet, and I'm going to soon, in this particular type of cell division, these two new daughter cells are genetically identical to each other, and they are identical to the parent cell. So again, basically what happens is you have one cell, and it splits into two, and that gives you two genetically identical daughter cells. So any questions so far? And again, this is just an introduction. We're going to get into more detail. Sort of like we did photosynthesis and respiration, right? We gave you the overview, talked about the big picture, and then kind of went back and started looking into more detail. All right, before cells can go through cellular division, the chromosomes have to duplicate. And that's going to be a lot of what this part of this chapter is going to be about. And this part of the exam is going to be a lot about chromosomes. So when we talk about cellular division, so many of the questions are basically about what happened to the chromosomes, and which stage are the chromosomes doing this, and which stage are the chromosomes doing that. So keep that in mind as I'm teaching this, because that's largely what the exam is going to be about. So a lot of things are happening, but we're going to focus on what happens mostly with what happens to the chromosomes. In case you don't know what chromosomes are, you should by now. I think we mentioned it previously, but those are structures containing DNA. So that's where your DNA is. It's in your chromosomes. This particular type of cell division that we're going to talk about, which I haven't named yet, yes?
When you say that our DNA is in the chromosomes, ain't it like 28 of them, so all of our DNA is just in the chromosome, there's nowhere else, like in the blood or nothing?
So, for the most part, what we're focused on in this course is going to be the DNA that's in your chromosomes. It's in each of your cells. Each of your cells has a nucleus, as I'm going to teach later, and your nucleus has those 23 pairs of chromosomes, and that's the ones we're going to focus on, yeah. Now, granted, also in your cells, not that you need to know this, but I'll probably bring it up later. Remember, we learned about mitochondria. That's where reproduction happens. The mitochondria also happens to have its own DNA. We don't even talk about that. And that not that you need to know, but that's interesting DNA too, because it's circular, like a bacteria instead of linear like ours. And also you get it 100% from your mom. So your mitochondrial DNA you got from your mom. It's not a mix of your mom and dad. She got it from your grandmother. She got it from your great grandmother, so on and so forth. So that's what makes mitochondrial DNA so interesting. Because again, it's not a mix. That's a straight female lineage. Interesting, but not important. So that's why we don't really talk about it. I mean, not important for the context of this class. But anyway, some of this the cellular division I'm going to teach you about that I am going to name soon. It has some roles. Some of the stuff it does is it replaces damaged or lost cells. So again, like I said, as you're sitting here, you are going through cellular reproduction. That is one of the reasons, right? So you probably have some damaged, dead, or lost cells. Cells die, and those are getting replaced. Also, growth. Now, you guys probably done, well, not probably, some of you, most of you probably done growing. Some of you may not be, but yeah. So like, think about it. When you're born, you are like X number of chromosomes, but then it's not like all of those, or it's not chromosomes, I'm sorry, cells. It's not like each of those cells just got bigger and bigger and bigger until you were an adult, right? Instead, you just had added more and more and more and more and more cells. And then, of course, there's actual sexual reproduction, and we'll talk about that later too. Not even sexual reproduction, it could also be asexual reproduction. So these are the three main roles that cell division plays in the life of an organism. So the next word for attendance is three roles that cell division plays in the life of an organism are reproduction, replaces damaged or lost cells, and blank. What is the third role that cell division plays in the lives of organisms? one that I did not say. All right, again, still an overview. Here's some pictures from the old textbook that kind of talk about what I'm talking about here. So cell replacement. So here's a picture of a kidney cell. You can see it's kind of split. We're going to learn about what that split means later. But that's a cell that has divided itself, right? Because it is replacing. It's replacing a cell. Growth, right? This is what I was talking about here. You know, again, at fertilization, you were one cell. When that sperm cell met with the egg cell, and we're going to learn about that later too. Once they merged, that was actually, even though it came from two cells, that was one cell once they merged. And then that one cell turned to two, and that two turned to four, the four turned to 8, 16, so on and so forth, right? That's how you grow, is multiplying, adding the number of cells. Also, reproduction. So some organisms are able to just, that's how they reproduce, is by basically splitting their cell in half, right? An amoeba is one example, not that you need to know that. Same thing with the kidney cell. You don't need to know anything about kidney cells or amoebas. That's just an example. We'll learn more about embryos later. This is another good example, sea stars. I don't know if you can see, here we have like this tiny little sea star with a huge arm, right? And what's happened there is if you cut the arm off of a sea star, it'll just grow back. So somewhere there's a sea star that has a little tiny arm because it grew the arm back. But also, the arm itself grew a new sea star. So, and again, and now those two organisms, wherever they are, those are clones of each other. They are genetically identical. Similar things happen with clippings. Like if you were to get, I don't know, cilantro or basil from Kroger, and then you put it in some water, it might grow some roots, right? That's basically a clipping, and then you can grow a whole new set of plants from it. But genetically, they're all the same. So they're all clones, that first little piece that you had. And again, those are just examples. So here we go. Here's a term you need to know. We're going to talk about two different types of reproduction in this portion of the semester. The first type that you need to learn about is asexual reproduction. You need to know the difference between asexual and sexual. Sexual is the other one I'm going to teach you about. So in asexual reproduction, there is no egg and there is no sperm. Definitely need to know that. For asexual reproduction, there is no egg, no sperm. So far, everything that I've taught you, and I told you I haven't named it yet, has been asexual reproduction. For example, I told you that the parent and the offspring have identical genes, right? So that one cell divides into two, right? So then you have two offspring, two daughter cells. They're all genetically identical to each other. Asexual reproduction is how single-celled organisms reproduce. And it is also used by many multicellular organisms. So we already gave you some examples, right? So sea stars, clippings from a plant. Yeah. You can look up, I said others with a question mark because you can look that up for independent work. What are some other examples of multicellular organisms that can reproduce via asexual reproduction? For that matter, not to confuse things, this is only for independent work. If you want to look it up, you don't need to know this, but are there any single-celled organisms that reproduce sexually instead of asexually? You might find some interesting stuff if you look into that. Fungi are some very interesting organisms, let's put it that way. Anyway, that's asexual reproduction. So the type of cellular division that asexual reproduction comes from is mitosis. So those two words you should associate together, asexual reproduction and mitosis. Mitosis is the cellular division that is responsible for asexual reproduction. You need to know that. But it's also responsible for the stuff we mentioned earlier, growth and maintenance of multicellular organisms. So, right, like I said, you're sitting here right now, your cells, some of your cells are reproducing. Some of your cells are going through cellular division, and that cellular division is called mitosis. So you're not sitting there making a new organism, right? You're not making a clone of yourself, but some of your cells are going through growth and maintenance. So again, you should definitely associate mitosis with asexual reproduction. You should associate it with growth and maintenance of multicellular organisms. You should associate it, since it's associated with asexual reproduction, you should also associate it with everything that I had on the previous slide. So no sperm and egg. The offspring being genetically identical to the parent. All those things that I mentioned in the previous cell. So that's asexual reproduction. We're going to come back to that. That's, again, still just like a broad overview introduction. So guess what the other type of reproduction is? If one of them is asexual reproduction, and I think I've already said it earlier, but what's the next type of cellular reproduction?
Sexual.
Good. Sexual reproduction. I'm introducing it now, but we're not really going to get into it until the next chapter. Granted, the old textbook combined them into one chapter, but here we go. Sexual reproduction is basically, in many ways, the opposite of asexual, obviously, because in this case, it does need an egg and a sperm, unlike asexual reproduction. These egg and sperm are called gametes. You will need to know that, but again, we're not really going to cover this officially until next chapter. So that's a term I guess you can learn then. But yeah, here's your first introduction to that term, gamete. The production of these gametes is done in something called meiosis. And again, we're going to learn about that in the next chapter. So for now, these are just introductions to these terms. But you should definitely associate mitosis with asexual reproduction and meiosis with sexual reproduction, specifically the production of egg or sperm. Or I guess in some cases, depending on the organism, both egg and sperm. Again, there's some interesting stuff out there sexually. Then there's like, going off on another tangent here, it's not important but interesting. Seahorses, I mean, they are male and female, as you would expect, but once the male fertilizes the eggs, the male then keeps the eggs. So you might say the male is pregnant. It's not the proper term, that's not necessarily pregnant, but it does hold the eggs in its abdomen. So another interesting thing we could look up for in working. Anyway, any questions about the slide? We're still in introduction mode here. Also, again, I want to really make sure this is important. Make sure you know this. Even though we've started this new information, this information will not be on chapter 2. Exam 2. So when you take that exam, make sure you don't, if there's any questions about mitosis or meiosis on this next exam, that's the wrong answer. So I'm telling you that now. I put it there for people who aren't paying attention. So I'm telling you now, for exam 2, if you see mitosis or meiosis, that's not one of the correct options. For example, and this is a good time for me to remind you, when you answer any questions about photosynthesis, the only 2 good options are either going to be light reactions or Calvin cycle. The rest of them are there to trick people who aren't paying attention. So as long as you guess light reactions or Calvin cycle, even if you get it wrong, you'll at least get partial credit. If it's about photosynthesis, it needs to be one of those 2. And if it's anything on exam 2, if it says mitosis or meiosis, or anything you learn in this chapter, that's not the correct answer. But anyway, that being said, let's talk about this slide. So the 2 kinds of reproduction that we've just talked about, which are sexual and asexual, these are both used for sexually reproducing organisms, right? So there's those different types of cellular reproduction. And if you're talking about organisms reproducing like humans are sexually reproducing organisms, right? So we use both. We use mitosis for growth and maintenance, and we use meiosis for reproduction. Unlike something like an amoeba, for example, or a bacteria, right? They don't do that. They don't do sexual reproduction. So for something that's asexually reproduces, they only use asexual reproduction. Any questions about this slide? All right. So it's 23 minutes in. Now I'm going to do the announcements and reminders. Give some late people some time to get here. Announcements and reminders. Again, like I said, we're about at the halfway point. As far as the content is concerned, we are at the halfway point, right? Because this new material is for the second half of the semester. Monday, March 10th is when spring break starts. So we've got next week, we're meeting. And then after that, we have spring break. So the end of spring break, you have these things that are due, right? The quizzes are due, or excuse me, what's it? So quiz 4 is due on, I think that's the 16th, yeah, the 16th. Exam 2 is due by the 16th. Of course, it's gonna be open today, I'm gonna open it. So don't think, oh man, he's making me take an exam over spring break. I'm not. You can take it way before spring break, right? We're done with that material, so you can take it early. As a reminder, it's usually about 50 questions, and you have 50 minutes to take it, and it's a closed book exam. If you need more time to take it, let me know sometime before then. We can meet online, and I can proctor your exam, and then you can take as long as you want. Once exam 2 closes, which is on March 16th, so does the ability to retake exam 1. So now's the time to retake exam 1.
March 16th is the last day we can take exam 1 or today.
Good question. Exam 1, yeah.
Ends today.
No, March 16th. Sorry, yeah. March 16th ends, that's the due date for the second exam, and therefore also the due date for the take of the first exam. And it'll be a similar pattern next time. So the due date for exam 3 will be the due date for the retake of exam 2. Midterm grades will be due shortly after that. From now, what I haven't done yet is, unless you, like some of you have, already have 100 points of independent work, your grade is in there in the system because it's boosting your grade. For the rest of you, I haven't put your grades in because unless it's 100 points, it's going to hurt your grade. What I will do though, just to let you know, because it's only on WVSU Online, it's not affecting your actual grade. After I've turned your grades in to the university, then I'm going to go into WVSU Online and put your independent work grade in there. Because it's really, unless you've done a lot, it's going to drop your grade. I know that sounds horrible, but I'd rather it's only on paper. I want your grade to be dropped on paper now instead of at the due date. Because remember, the due date is the last day of the class. I don't want you to think, oh, I've got a B, but you haven't done any independent work. And then I put that 0 in for the independent work and it drops you down to a C, right? I don't want that. So I want you to know what your grade is now. I want you to give you the surprise in the middle of the semester as opposed to the end of the semester. So remember, when I do that in WVSU Online, it's only on WVSU Online, right? That's not your actual grade. That's just what it looks like. Your actual grade is only what I report to the university. So that's it for the announcements and reminders. Oh yeah, and then remember, be in lab today, locking the door at 10:01, so don't be late. I guess that's it. Some of you still, again, haven't done the videos or the pre-labs. You can still come, but you just can't do any of the experiments. That's it. Any questions? All right, let's move forward. We're also done with the first main bullet point of what cell reproduction accomplishes. Now we're going to move on to the second main bullet point, which is all about the cell cycle and mitosis. So we're really going to dig in here now. You know what cell reproduction accomplishes. You know the 2 different types. Now we're going to really dig into it and understand how the process works. And as far as the exam is concerned, most of the questions are going to come more from this second bullet point that we're about to jump into than that first bullet point. So before you can understand any of that stuff, you need to understand eukaryotic chromosomes. So that's what we're going to talk about. There's a little star next to that. So we're about to talk about eukaryotic cells. Your textbook also goes into prokaryotic cells, the bacteria and things like that. So if you want to take a note, if you're a studier, you might want to take a note. I'm not going to ask you any questions about the prokaryotic cells. So I'm going to teach you all about the eukaryotic cells and how that cellular reproduction works, because we're eukaryotes, right? So I'm focused on eukaryotes. Maybe I'll add some extra credit questions, maybe, about prokaryotes, but I'm not going to waste our time talking about them. Anyway, again, for eukaryotic cells, most of our genes, most of our chromosomes, right, because the genes are located on the chromosomes, are inside the nucleus. Again, Carla already asked the question. It's a great question. Technically, there's also some DNA in your mitochondria, but we're not going to talk about that. Technically, for plants too, they're chloroplasts. They also have their own DNA, but we won't talk about that either. You can look into it for independent work if you want. Each chromosome for a eukaryotic cell contains one long DNA molecule that has thousands of genes. So again, I'm sure you've seen pictures of them. You know, it's like one long molecule
like that. It's not like bacteria, which is circular, one long DNA molecule. You'll see plenty of better pictures as we move forward. The chromosome number depends on the species. I'm not going to ask you that, but it is slightly interesting, and I'll give you on the next slide, I'll give you some examples of that. And another term you need to know, and this is a term we're going to use a lot in this whole section, all for exam 3, genome. The genome is a cell's complete complement of DNA. So basically, another way to say that, it's all the genes. And as usual, I invite you for independent work to say, hey, according to the textbook, a genome is a cell's complete complement of DNA. According to this source, a genome is, and then like you do direct quotes, tell me exactly what your other source says, and then maybe write a sentence or two where you compare and contrast the two different definitions. Or for that matter, if you want to, you can do a third and a fourth source, whatever you want. But it's a very easy independent work topic. Anyway, let's see. Yeah, we'll move forward. Any questions about this slide? Here's some examples. You do not need to know these examples. I'll put a big X through here. And this is not from your textbook. This is from the old textbook. If anything, and I don't think I would do this unless I change the exam. If anything, I might give you this graph and ask you a question. Like, so I'd ask you to decipher, like, how many chromosomes does a giraffe have? And then, oh, right there, giraffe, 30, right? So you don't need to know any of this. But yeah, that would be all you would need to do is to be able to decipher this graph. Yeah, some interesting stuff. So that's another great independent work topic if you're interested. Think of some organism that you're interested in. And this graph is interesting to me because they only chose animals, but there's also plants, for example. Plants have chromosomes. They have different chromosome numbers depending on the species. So you can look all that up. I also find this slightly interesting because look, you have a deer at least on this list. This deer, this particular type of deer, has the lowest number of chromosomes on this list. Meanwhile, this little bitty rat has the highest number of chromosomes on this graph. Once again, it's another independent work topic. You look up and say, what species has the most chromosomes? And I'm not talking about on this graph, I just mean of all time. Which species has the smallest number of chromosomes? Humans have 46 chromosomes. Which other species happen to have 46 chromosomes? Things like that. But again, this is just an example. You don't need to know anything on that. Well, you will eventually need to know that humans have 46 chromosomes. But the rest of the graph is not important. Okay, any questions about that side? All right, so what are chromosomes made of? You learned this earlier. Now you're learning it again. Chromosomes are made up of something called chromatin. It's not necessarily that I'm going to ask you what, I'm not going to necessarily ask you that. I might or might not, I'm not sure. But I am going to use the term, especially a little bit later in this section, not this chapter, but later in this section, so you need to know what it means. Chromosomes are made up of chromatin. Chromatin is made up of about half protein, half DNA. And yes, technically, then when you, like I said, when you stretch one strand of DNA out, it's longer than, it's probably about 6 feet. So therefore, as you can imagine, if there's 46 of them, and you're just cramming them into one tiny little cell, you can imagine, it's obviously very longer than the nucleus. It's longer than some of you guys. If you're shorter than 6 foot, then your chromosomes are longer than you, much less your cell. As the cell is preparing to divide, the chromosomes coil up. I'm going to put it next to this because it is true and you do need to know it, but I'm going to explain it later in more detail. It forms compact structures that can be seen with a microscope. And I'll give you an example of that from the next slide. So in short, if you see a picture, like if you're looking at a microscope or see a picture of a microscope, and you can see the chromosomes, that means the cell is either preparing to divide or it is dividing. Otherwise, the chromosomes are just unwound. They're uncoiled. They're just a big squiggly mess. But yeah, let's see. I guess for the exam, none of this is really important, except, like I said, this part. But we're going to come back to that. So for now, it's not even like I'm giving you this and you better know it now because we're not talking about it again. This is still an introduction. Yes, DNA is about 6 feet tall, 6 feet long. That's interesting, but it's not important.
How's it even work?
What's that? You squishing it in there?
Yeah.
It's just so thin. Yeah.
I was gonna say, is it like a fiber?
Yeah, we'll learn a little bit more about it. But basically, it's just so thin. And as you're going to learn, because like I said here, the chromosomes coil up. Wait. Should be, yeah, I'm so glad I noticed that. Chromosomes uncoil when they're prepared to divide. See, I'm glad I said we'll come back to that. But yeah, they're so thin. They might be really long, but they're really thin. So yeah, that's how they can get squished in there like that. Imagine, like, for example, if you ever had like a sewing kit and saw one of those spools of stuff, right? Imagine if you were to undo it. I would assume I could get it from here to that door at least, right? They're really long, but they can also crumble up. They take up very little space. Same with DNA. But anyway, again, this is all just kind of an introduction. You will need to know that chromatin is made up of DNA and protein, and that will be important later, because later we're going to talk about how genes work. And that protein is going to be important in that part. And to answer your question, which we're going to talk about later, the DNA is wrapped around those proteins. But for now, we're not worried about that. We will, but not yet. So here's a picture of what I'm talking about. Those are the chromosomes, right? You can see the individual chromosomes. So it's a little bit hard here. So if you're online, you probably have an advantage, the people who are in person right now. You can see it better online. But yeah, there's actually individual chromosomes. Here, again, it's hard to see. It's just a big blurry mess because all the chromosomes are uncoiled. Just an uncoiled mess. All right. So, again, talking more about this idea of chromatin, right, which is half DNA, half protein. That's where we get this right here. And to answer your question about how does it fit in there, well, the DNA is packed into an elaborate multi-level system of coiling and folding. Some terms you might need to know, not necessarily because I'm going to ask you, but because I'm going to use them, both in teaching you this chapter and also in the exam. Histones are the proteins used to package the DNA. As far as we're concerned, when I say the chromosomes are half, or chromatin is half DNA and half proteins, as far as we're concerned, that's what it is. That's the protein. That's the histones. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. Now, when you put a bunch of histones together and you wrap the DNA around it, like I'm going to show you on the next slide, technically those are called nucleosomes. Again, for the exam, I'm not necessarily going to ask you what is a histone, what is a nucleosome, how are they the same, how are they related, how are they different. I'm not necessarily going to ask you questions about it, but I will use those terms when I'm asking you something else. So to understand that question, you'll need to know what histones and nucleosomes are. And again, on the next slide, I think it'll make a lot more sense. When you can visualize it, I think it makes a lot more sense. So here you go. You've got the DNA double helix, right? And it kind of winds around. And what happens is it winds around these histones. And in this picture, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, still there's 8. We've got 8 histones with the DNA wrapped around it. And that's it. And each time that happens, right, that little group of 8 histones with the DNA wrapped around it, that is called a nucleosome. And again, I'm not going to ask you what a histone is. I'm not going to ask you what a nucleosome is. But I will use that term. And later, when you learn how genes work, which is all about reading the DNA, like there's a code written in these little ladders, rungs, right? There's a code there. So to read that code, there's going to be basically a cellular machine that has to clamp onto the DNA and read it. And as you can imagine, if it's wrapped up tightly on a nucleosome, that's going to make things a little bit difficult. And that will play a role later, not in this chapter, but in this section, when we talk about stuff for exam 3.
So inside that, is that like the stuff in the middle of the DNA, is that supposed to control or mix up our color eyes and lips?
These little rungs?
Yes.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that we're going to learn about, not this chapter, not the next chapter, but the chapter after that. We'll talk about the code. But for now, I only wanted to bring it up because I wanted to remind you later. Later, I'm going to bring this back up, histones and nucleosomes. Later, this will be important. That's why. But for now, for chapter 6 and chapter 7, this doesn't matter. All right. Here we're still looking at the same picture. We've zoomed out. You can see, right, here's a nucleosome, right? Each one of those is another nucleosome. And then that itself winds up like that, and it kind of coils up. And then that itself has its own little shape. So you can see it's really, really tightly, densely packed. And that's how we get that much DNA inside of a chromosome, inside of a nucleus. And then again, all that stuff coils up in a particular shape, and then that gives you what you see down there at the bottom, which is a duplicated chromosome. You can see there's this term here, sister chromatids. I haven't introduced you to that yet, but I will soon. But yeah, what you have here in this picture down here at the bottom is a chromosome that has duplicated itself. So like there's one up here, one down here. When they're together, technically they're called sister chromatids, and you'll learn more about that later. Same with this. This is another term you're going to learn later. It's this little part in the middle called a centromere that holds the two duplicated chromosomes together. You learn about that later, but for now, you've been introduced to those terms. Any questions about this slide? And the next slide has all of the things we've looked at, just zoomed out so it's all together. Also, I should point out, these slides are from the old textbook. So if you're reading your textbook and the pictures, you don't like those pictures, you're going to want to download this PowerPoint and look at those. So let's talk about, now that we know some more about eukaryotic chromosomes, let's talk about this important part of duplicated chromosomes. Like I said earlier, before the cell can go through cellular reproductions, the chromosomes have to duplicate themselves. So that's what we're about to talk about. And remember, this whole thing, this whole chapter, the big picture, is we're talking about cellular reproduction. So before we can get to the cells actually reproducing, we have to talk about duplicated chromosomes. So obviously duplicating chromosomes, another way of saying that is copying the DNA, right? So if you have one chromosome that has certain codes on it, genes, you need to make a perfect copy of it. And then here's that term I told you that you're going to need to know, and there it is. You need to know that. So when one chromosome duplicates itself, now you have two copies. Those two copies are called sister chromatids. They're genetically identical, right? Because it's a perfect copy. That chromosome perfectly copies itself, right? So they're genetically identical. They are joined together at the waist in this part called the centromere. I'm not going to ask you questions about the centromere, but I will use the term centromere a lot to explain how this whole process works. You need to know what a centromere is, so there you go, now you know. So the next word for attendance is to answer this question. Sister chromosomes contain identical genes or unique genes. Sister chromatids. So when a chromosome duplicates itself, the result is two sister chromatids. Are their genes identical or are they unique? The next slide I'm going to show you is a picture of what I'm talking about. Again, a picture from the old textbook. At the top here, we have the original chromosome, right? That it's ready to, it duplicates itself. So we have two sister chromatids. You can see they're attached. What they haven't shown in the picture is the centromere, which is where they are attached. But they've done that. So there we go. For now, anyway, we're going to obviously dig a little bit deeper. It's not that easy. But for now, that's chromosome duplication. We're done for now talking about chromosome duplication. At the surface, it's just that simple. You've got one chromosome that makes a perfect copy of itself, and now you have sister chromatids. Obviously, that's not the end of the whole story, though. When a cell divides, which is this whole big picture, right? That's what this whole chapter is about, not what we just finished talking about. But when the cell divides, then also those sister chromatids divide. They get separated. Remember that last picture I showed you? They were together, right? They were stuck together in the centromere. But when the cells divide, obviously the chromosomes need to go their own way too. Once that happens, once the sister chromatids are pulled apart, we then consider them chromosomes again. Okay, so when they're together, stuck together, we call them sister chromatids. Once you pull them apart, we call them chromosomes. Yeah. Now, even though they've been pulled apart, they're still identical to the original chromosome, right? Because it's still genetically identical. We had the one chromosome, it duplicated itself, so we had two, and then those things get separated, and they're both genetically identical. The next slide I'm going to show you is a picture of this happening. And it's just like a part 2 of the picture we saw on the slide before this. Right? So again, the slide we saw before this is this one. Now we're just adding this new information. Started off with one chromosome, it duplicated itself, and now we have these two sister chromatids attached to each other at the centromere that's not being shown. Then it goes through cellular division, and they separate. And now they are complete chromosomes. And again, I'll remind you, most of these questions, most of what we're focused on is the chromosomes. You can imagine when cells reproduce and they split, there's a lot of things going on. But we're mostly just focused on the chromosomes. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the other stuff. The majority of what we talk about, the majority of the questions are going to be like, at what stage do the chromosomes do this? At what stage do the chromosomes do that? So this is why, again, big picture. I recommend memorize this before you start memorizing the other stuff I'm going to teach you. Right? The other stuff is going to be adding details to what I just taught you. All right, any questions about that? All right, I can introduce you. Let me introduce you to the cell cycle. That'd be a good place to stop, and then the introduction to the cell cycle. That way when we come back, we can finish talking about the cell cycle, and then jump into the meat and potatoes of this chapter as far as the exam is concerned, which is talking about mitosis and cytokinesis. So here we go, the cell cycle. You need to be very familiar with the cell cycle. You're going to need to know the different parts of the cell cycle. But this mostly what's on this side is just an introduction. So when you're reading this, don't think, all right, these are going to be test questions. They're not necessarily. This is just an introduction. So what is the cell cycle? It is an ordered sequence of events. And that'll make more sense when I tell you the different sequence of events. And again, that's what you're going to need to know for the exam, at least this portion of the exam. You're going to need to know what happens in these different sequence of events. I'm going to give you their names. I'm going to tell you what happens. The cell cycle starts when the cell is first formed, and it basically ends when the cell divides into two new cells. So technically, you wouldn't say the cell cycle ended when a cell dies, because obviously cells die, but that's just the death of a cell. But the cell cycle ends when that one cell, divides into two new cells. And of course, once it divides into two new cells, that is the beginning of the cell cycle for those two new cells. In a sense, like I was kind of hinting at earlier, you can almost think of this as the lifetime of a cell. But again, I don't like that term necessarily because it's not, when you think of lifetime, you probably think birth to death, like we do for us. But at the cellular level, what we're really looking at is from birth to reproduction. So again, if a cell were to die before being able to reproduce, it just ended the cell cycle. It didn't, you know what I mean? It didn't complete the cell cycle. It just stopped. Here's the biggest part. And again, my suggestion is to learn the biggest parts, then start adding the details. The cell cycle is broken down into two parts, two main parts, and that's interphase and mitotic phase. Later, and like I said, you should memorize that. It's interphase and then mitotic phase. Once you have that memorized, then we're going to start with the interphase itself is broken down into different parts. And the mitotic phase is broken down into different parts. But that's the biggest division, right? Cell cycle is called interphase and metaphase. Here's a picture of it. Of course, this picture also includes the subdivision, but this whole thing from here to here, that's interphase. And of course, like I said, later you're going to learn that interphase itself is broken down into G1, S, G2, right? And then this part right here is the mitotic phase. And again, later, you're going to learn all the different parts of the mitotic phase. So for now, when you're studying this, I recommend memorize the fact that the entire cell cycle is broken down into interphase and the mitotic phase. Memorize that. Then start memorizing the other phases. Then start memorizing what happens during those other phases. So the last word for attendance, Other than, remember, you have to send me, at the end of this, you need to send me one question based on the material. The last word for attendance is, the cell cycle is broken down into two main parts. Interphase and blank phase. Cell cycle is broken down into two main parts, interphase and blank phase. And we will end 2 minutes early. That way, when we come back on Friday, we'll start talking more about these phases. And we'll start digging deeper and talking about how they're also subdivided. That's it. I'll see you at 10. I'll be in here for office hours so I can help get things ready for the lab.